3PNR with Adam R. Welcome to 3PNR. I'm your host, Adam R. Joining me for this episode is Leslie Ghiglieri, author of The Decision to Kill. Leslie, how you doing?
I'm doing great. Thanks.
Thanks for being on. I'm glad to have your time. You got a very interesting book here, a case I'm not familiar with or wasn't familiar with, and I'm sure a lot of people aren't. They should be. It's actually a really, really disturbing story to be told. Let's open with, let's talk about you, where your background is, what got you to the point of writing the book.
Well, as far as my law enforcement related background, I was a 911 dispatcher in Santa Cruz, California for 3 years and enjoyed that work very much. So when we made the decision to move to Oregon, I went ahead and got a job with the Josephine County Sheriff's Department, which is in Southern Oregon. And I worked with that department for 4 years. And during the course of the time of me working there, I had the opportunity to also work with a computer system that provided law enforcement information sharing between agencies. So the agencies were interconnected, and I dealt with 17 agencies in Josephine and Jackson County, from district attorneys to jails, probation offices, juvenile departments, and the law enforcement agencies. And I worked as a field rep for that company, providing help with their hardware and instruction in how to use software. And I did that for 4 years, and then I retired.
And so you got more involved with the true crime aspect of stuff. You know, Oregon, my brother lives there. We were talking in pre-podcast. Great place, beautiful scenery. The weather could be a little harsh a lot of times. And I'd spoken to a lot of homicide detectives and investigators in that Northwest area, and just it's intriguing what goes on, like with serial killers, like that Warren Forrest guy I recently read about. I'd spoken to Cloyd Steiger. He's a homicide detective, and they work some bizarre cases up in that region. So the story with this kid in the book, now the book's titled The Decision to Kill, right? This is a teenager.
Yes. Yeah, the subtitle says a true crime story of a teenage killer and the mother who loved him.
Yeah, it's so let's get into this. So you eventually retire from law enforcement, and what drove you in the direction of this book, this story in particular?
It was one of those situations that sort of finds you instead of you searching something out. And the date of that crime was in 1986 when the murder actually happened. And the couple involved were named Cherie and Don Weir. And this couple I happened to meet in 1986, about 6 months before the crime happened. And so we had met, we actually attended the same small church in Grants Pass, but I didn't know them for some reason. Sometimes you have different friends than people in that church community. And so I never really met either of them and had the opportunity to do that in February. Then some time went by. We were friends. My husband and I ended up moving into the adjoining county. So I sort of lost contact with her for a number of years. I would see her once in a while. She would have gatherings for women that were friends of hers at her property. And then in 2016, many years after the murder, I went to an event she had at her home. And at that time, I was talking with a friend of mine. We were talking about Cherie and talking about how we admired her and the life that she had lived and the beautiful property that she lived on, and just how when they moved to Oregon in the first place, it was just scrub, and how they had transformed it into this beautiful property where they held weddings. It's just gorgeous. Anyway, we were discussing that and what had happened with the murder and her son and all of that. And she just expressed how she thought that Cherie's stories should be made into a book. Of course, people say that kind of thing all the time, but I was talking to Cherie after everyone had left and just about her life, just going back over what had happened. And she expressed to me that she had always wanted her story to be told. And at this point in her life, she was in her late 70s and not in especially good health. And she said she'd always wanted her story told, but the opportunity just never seemed to present itself. So the two of us were talking, and I told her I've always enjoyed writing, had to do quite a bit of that in my work. And I offered to write the story of what took place if she would like me to do that. So we just went into kind of an agreement at that time, and that's how it all began.
Yeah, because when you hear their story with Don and Cherie, they live in California. They want to buy they buy property in Oregon, right? And now they're waiting for capital to build a home on it. And later on, I believe her grandfather left her an inheritance of like $20,000. And in that era, as I read in the book, 20,000 goes a long. You know, when I first heard that statement, like she got 20,000, I was thinking in my mind, like that's barely going to do anything. But then you got to realize it's in the 70s, and that goes a long way as far as construct, and especially in Oregon, right?
Yes.
Here in Florida, with $20,000, you'll be lucky to build a decent mailbox. You know, but at that time they're building this dream home, and they're obviously adopting. So the kid himself, Dwayne. He exampled ailments as a toddler. And so let's talk about Dwayne from the start to the point of this murder and what you discovered about him.
Well, the couple, when they married, they wanted nothing more than to have a big family. Both of them, that was their dream. And they both were outdoors people and had the desire to move to the Pacific Northwest. So they were united in that goal as a couple. But unfortunately, they tried for 8 years to conceive unsuccessfully, and then went to fertility doctors who, you can imagine, in the 1970s were less able to help them than they even can now. So they decided that it was time to make the decision to adopt. So they adopted this little boy who was born in 1970, and he was 3 weeks old. So they adopted him, and they couldn't have been happier. They were so pleased to finally have a son. And it wasn't long after he was home that he started to exhibit random problems. He would get these welts on his skin whenever he was cold and wet. And they pretty inflamed, and obviously he was uncomfortable with them. And she'd take him to the doctor, and the doctor would try all these remedies, and unsuccessfully, just kind of odd problems. He had that, and then he developed some breathing problems that he was diagnosed as having asthma from a young age. And at a certain point later on, he was given an inhaler. He had blood in his urine that they couldn't figure out why. At one point, when he was 2 years old, they took him to the hospital, and he was there for several days. And the only thing he came out with was a diagnosis saying that he had blood in his urine and these welts that were undiagnosed. And they gave him a prognosis of pretty good or hopeful. You know, he just had these random issues, and the couple, they never wavered. They hated to see him uncomfortable or struggling with these things and wanted to try to find a solution. But they just figured it's part of parenting and it's part of what you do with your kids when they have problems. You try to see if you can find a solution and do the best you can. So there were a lot of visits to the doctor's office, a lot of emergency runs when he had breathing difficulties. So he grew up kind of in a time when, by the time he got to middle school, and he was an only child, and they lived out in the country, it was hard for him to assimilate. He didn't have the physical abilities that allowed him to do sports, which is an important thing when you're that age and you live out in the country, and that's kind of what people do. They're active and busy, and they participate in things like sports, and it was hard for him to fit in that regard. So I think it added to maybe his feeling of not belonging.
Yeah, especially in that timeline. That's in that age group when the social dynamics starting to come into full circle. And this is unfortunate, but in that age group, children, when they see someone who's lacking physically, you're a victim. And so that probably had a profound effect on the psychology. Over more ailments. I know this personally. I know because I have sinus issues, right? I'm allergic to cats, and whenever. So the person I was living with for many of years had cats, and it was like having a flu forever. And I know what that did to my psychology, right? It really just drags you down. Like, oh, when am I going to get over this? I'm so tired of this. You loom on the edge of you're just tired of being sick. And everything this young man sounds to me, everything I've heard about him sounds like, and this is in the 70s, mind you. It sounds like an autoimmune disease. And I don't know that we were able to diagnose autoimmune diseases in the 70s because lupus is this autoimmune disease that became more prevalent in the 90s. Prior to that, it was an unknown ailment. They didn't realize that the immune system was attacking itself. So with this kid, it sounds like he had something autoimmune. And like you were saying, now he's in a middle school and he's in this position where his peers are not looking at him as an equal. On top of ailment, on top of more than likely the abuse of his peers, then, by the way, was he aware he's adopted at this point?
I'm not sure at what point they disclosed that to him. That's an interesting question. It seems like an obvious question. It's one I don't remember asking or us talking about because in my mind's eye, I guess, because Cherie always saw him as hers, it wasn't even that he was adopted. You know what I mean? So
Right.
It was kind of a non-issue. I know that he was told. It wasn't like they didn't let him know, but at what point, I'm not sure.
I would have to guess when he's going to the hospital as a kid a lot, that he became aware of it because at some point there's a rule out phase with physicians and staff. And one of the questions that are always going to be elemental are, what's the family history? And so maybe he's not privy to it as being, direct from the family, but I'm sure he overheard or at least learned or observed this as a kid. So, good.
Oh, I was just going to say, well, that makes perfect sense. And maybe early on, because he did hear those conversations, it was just part of letting him know that was who he was and that they were fortunate enough to be able to have him in their family. And maybe it was just a matter of fact that had to be addressed early on because of those visits, because the visits started very early and continued. It was ongoing problems, and this problem, which was likely an autoimmune disease, would manifest itself differently as he got older.
Right. And then, an autoimmune disease unchecked, from what I've read, because my mother has lupus, so I did a lot of research into autoimmune diseases early on. If it goes unchecked, it could affect the brain. Right, you could almost hallucinate. Right, there's because bear in mind your body's attacking itself, and when people have these near-death experiences, or if you're in a car accident, your brain releases chemicals to kind of relax the body from being overwhelmed, giving yourself a cardiac arrest, essentially. That's why a lot of people, when they have near-death experiences, they report things like, oh, I saw my family, or I saw these guardian angels. I'm not disputing that. I'm just saying when you have a chemical release with DMT, DMT is something you take for hallucinogens, right? It's a psychological trip. So with this young man, is his body under such duress that his brain is releasing chemicals to either cope, or is it, or the latter? Maybe it's causing him to be, malicious. Because when you read the book and you hear the story anyway, when it gets to the point where he's going to kill his father or stepfather or his adopted father, it's cold. He gets himself into an inebriated state, and he turns a light on in a bathroom. He's waiting to make sure his eyes adjust. Everything about that is premeditated. So it was a lingering thought, even though he had these thoughts prior to it. In the act itself, to remain that calm, even have to have the presence of mind to pick up the shell. Everything about that's premeditated. So it's worrisome. So did they ever maybe conclude what it is his ailments are, or just no?
Well, they never did while he was at home. No one ever, either from the physical standpoint or any sort of behavioral issues that were a concern to Cherie, no one was capable that she saw of pinpointing what was going on with him, either physically or mentally. They were just, the best everyone could do was deal with the outward symptoms.
Right. So let's talk about this. Let's because you did a lot of research. I'm obviously going to listen to the audiobook again all the way through. So I'm one of these people, I like studying. Right? I want to know all the details. I can't help myself. So let's talk about the parents, because they had a distrust for him. He was, he's exhibiting behaviors of pathological lying and then substance abuse. So let's get into that.
Okay, well, you're right. You just nailed it, what it was. The first time that, let me backtrack on that, because Cherie was quoted in the newspaper after the murder saying that she had sought out help for him from a behavioral point of view very early on. I think he was around fifth grade, that originally she saw things in him that were disturbing to her. She, as a youngster, had babysat children quite a bit, and she was used to kids and used to their differences and development, but she just saw things in Dwayne that didn't seem right to her. And I don't know if in fifth grade she actually sought somebody out as far as counseling with him because of that. But as he was into junior high, there were more behavioral issues that drove her to seek out counseling for him. So they did seek that out. She went multiple times and tried to get him, while he was still a little younger, to go and kind of with the idea that we're having problems here with you and your behavior, and if you will go with me to counseling, maybe I can understand you more, and putting it really on her to try to get him to go, which it didn't work. But he exhibited the first time of stealing that she knew when he was 12, which would put him about that middle school age. He had a girlfriend, and she had a ring that had belonged to her grandmother, and Dwayne came home with his girlfriend after school, and Cherie saw that the girlfriend was wearing her prized, treasured ring. And so that was the first evidence of Dwayne stealing, which was pretty serious, that he would go into her jewelry box and steal jewelry. After that, there were incidences where he stole from stores. Once he stole like a ink pen, and Cherie was just perplexed with that. Like, why would you steal an ink pen? We have plenty of pens. Like, she couldn't understand a lot of his behavior because it didn't make sense to her. It wasn't things he needed, or I don't, no one knew if he just got a thrill out of doing it or what, but he was stealing. He was caught several times and ended up at one point charges were pressed because Don and Cherie they wanted to support Dwayne, but they weren't going to bail him out of his wrongdoing. So he did have to do some community service. It just got worse because he ended up getting involved in drugs, and that happened through a band that he was playing with, and that happened at 12 also. The family. You have to understand that when Don and Cherie moved to Oregon, they had this idealized dream of what their life in Oregon was going to be like. And in a lot of ways, they achieved that because they were able to develop this property into a beautiful, beautiful place. But their dream mostly involved a family. And Don had dreams of having this relationship with his son where they could hunt and fish together and do outdoor activities. And he was just very excited to have that sort of relationship with his son. But whether Dwayne was just disinterested in those activities or if it was partly because of his physical problems, his inability maybe to perform in those activities, easily. He wasn't frail, but it certainly affected his ability to do things. He and Don had trouble sort of finding common ground. So Cherie was always looking for ways that they could relate to Dwayne and found it in music. They realized that Dwayne was very interested in music, and they supported that by purchasing him a guitar and a set of drums. And he would listen to music on his CD and play along with his instruments. Well, at 12, he found a group of boys that were interested in starting up a band, and they invited Dwayne to be part of that. And Cherie was reluctant. They were pretty conservative parents and very watchful over what he did. And they didn't know this family, were reluctant to give him permission to go up there and spend time with them. But after Cherie talked to the mother, she was given the assurance that everything would be supervised and that he was welcome there. And so Cherie let her guard down a little bit and decided to let him go, wanting to be supportive and wanting him to have friends. But a short time after he started going up there, they discovered that he had a bag of marijuana, which they found out through talking to him that the parents grew and smoked marijuana, and they were smoking it with the kids. So here, this activity that they thought was perfect, he had some friends, he could play his music, turned out to be the introduction into the drug world. And I know a lot of people say that there are those that use drugs recreationally, but there are also those that once they get the sense of what being high is all about, they just look for reasons to achieve that in a greater and greater fashion. And that's what Dwayne did. It just introduced him to feeling high, and it just created even worse situation for him.
Imagine, when you hear him stealing like the pen, and like a pen, like you said, there's no value in that. I think it's the most criminals like being the smartest guy in the room. They like to know they could get away with it, right? And at a young age, being able to go to a store and steal a pen and get away with it, there's both a rush and then I outsmarted them, right? There's that feeling. It's a euphoric thing for them. And as far as the mother stealing the mom's ring, that's a big flag to me. If you're willing to steal a family heirloom from your relatives to pass along to a stranger, whether it be the form of a girlfriend or a friend, that's a flag, because that shows really no. I don't know. It's like you don't care about your family. You don't care about what they're doing. They're buying you guitars. They're getting you in events. Everything about this kid. It's not like he had a neglected life. He wasn't abused. However, he has these medical conditions, and I'm sure, like we were discussing earlier, he's had to hear the brunt of what's going on with him. It's a mystery. And so you fast forward to the point where he finds a social dynamic that works for him. Unfortunately, it was poorly supervised. It introduced him to with the drug, like what you were saying with drugs. Some people take drugs because they're coping, right? It's their way of self-medicating. In his case, it might be both. It might end up being that, he found the drugs would silence the voices in his head and make him forget about the ailments. At the same time, that feeling of being high. And like you said, when weed doesn't work anymore, you got to go to the next level, because I'm not achieving that same level I was once upon a time doing. And at 12 years old, well, that's dangerous, because your ability to see things in hindsight and have forward thinking, it's not available yet. That's why we don't allow children to move out of the house till 18 or past, because their critical thinking is not in place yet. So it's disturbing to hear that this kid came from a good family, or good, decent people who cared a lot, and still it translated to the outcome we're seeing, which makes me wonder, because in the book you hear a bit about his mother putting him up for adoption. You don't really get into her family background, but it makes me wonder the psychology or the family history on the biological end. All right, that's, the father, the mother, like, did they example psychological issues with her ailments? I mean, it's tough, and in the 70s, you don't have Google. You can't just look up these people and find them and find out what their issues were. It's a real mystery, right? So there's a lot of moving parts to this.
Yeah, I think that's why I think this story is so interesting, because it's not a story about a crime that happened with a few tidbits about the family and then the bad guy and his motivation, and then what happens to him. Did they get justice for the crime, and what happened to the perpetrator eventually? It delves into a lot of these questions about, we're not, as we look back on Dwayne's life, knowing what he ended up doing, did these factors play a part in who he became and the decisions that he made? That's always the interesting conversation. I like that part.
Right. It's especially when you hear when he later on, so he gets in the part where he actually, he kills his father, or his adopted father anyway. And then he's going in a position where he's got to go to a juvenile center, and he doesn't want to go. He wants to go to an adult prison. I can't imagine anyone saying, "You know what I want to do? I want to go to a worse element." That's creepy, like everything about that sounds off. So
that his mother was, that was something that she still, as she would talk about that, just shook her head. It didn't make sense to her. And it wouldn't make sense to anybody. Why would you, here you are in big trouble, and you keep telling everybody you don't want to be in with a bunch of juvenile delinquents. That was kind of his mantra. And his lawyers tried to convince him, and the judge tried to convince him, and Cherie tried to convince him. It made no sense that he thought being in with hardcore criminals that had been in prison for years was a better way for him. It just made no sense. And maybe in the I don't know. I was going to say maybe in the long run there was something that was good about that for him, but he would have had much more, if he'd been in a juvenile facility, he would have had much more counseling, much more opportunity for
rehabilitation.
Yes.
Agreed. I mean, he would have been at least in an environment, because when you go to prison, let's be honest, you're not rehabbing. You're going to criminal college. You're going to you have to go there to survive, right? Frankly speaking, you're going to prison, it's survival time. There are prisons that have programs, and if you see an inmate that's willing to accept the program, they'll put you in a less dangerous block, maybe. But no matter what you do, if you go in there and you have a criminal mind, the likelihood of you rehabbing and becoming a great person thereafter, especially if you're on a long stint, it's very unlikely, So for this kid, what he should have, well, not that he should have. I mean, he's in a juvenile at the time. It should have been the state should have recognized he has a psychological issue, and he needs to be evaluated psychologically so we could rotate him back into society. And until that psychological issue is addressed, we have to keep him in this facility, because now you're taking a kid clearly troubled and putting him into a college where he can learn to be more troubled,
Mm-hmm.
And it's I don't know, it's a scary thought.
Well, what you have to remember is, because of the severity of the offense that he made, or he did, the juvenile system, I'm not sure how this compares in other states, but the juvenile facility that houses convicted juveniles has an arrangement with the overseeing corrections agency to house these juveniles, even though they're supposed to be in adult prison, until they reach the age of 25.
Right.
And if they're on good behavior, they can extend that time till their later 20s before they then transfer them to adult prison. But they're doing that as a favor because it's part of their purpose, because they are interested in juveniles. It's their vision, but they're not going to mess around. They're not taking somebody in that is going to stir up trouble for them.
Right. Yeah. Because this kid,
go ahead.
Yeah. What I read, this kid went there, and the first thing he did was attack someone with the purpose of getting out of a juvenile detention center to go to an adult place. I mean,
and he was proud of it.
Yeah, these are disturbing psychological markers, and I think, in this kid's case, he should have been in a psychological house. He should have went to a psych facility, not just for his rehab, but it would answer questions for his mother. Why? What was the root of this? Because I'm sure she that probably sat on her for a long time. Did I not do enough? Did I not see the signs? What if did we make this happen, et cetera, et cetera? That must have weighed on her for the rest of her life.
I'm sure it did. The dynamics with him went up and down, and she saw things that he would say to her, but I don't think it ever really was what she needed to have that question answered.
Right.
Although we haven't touched on it for people that haven't read the book, but he was diagnosed finally after he was arrested for murder. He was diagnosed by a psychiatrist as being a sociopath.
Yeah. Yep.
So that was his diagnosis. And honestly, I did some research about sociopaths, and they're pretty set. It's not like you can give them a different chemical to make their brain behave differently.
Right. It's not a chemical offset. A sociopath, from what you're learning, it's a program that's running in a computer already, and it's really hard to redirect that person, because there's no way to write new code into the human brain yet, So we're going to pause real quick,
I'm sorry.
Leslie. We're discussing how Dwayne, they finally diagnosed him as being a sociopath. So from that point, he's currently still in prison, right?
Oh, what do you mean? Like right now, or what do you mean?
Because I didn't follow up on. I did my best to not find out about him now. I wanted that for you. So what's Dwayne now? Where's he now?
He passed away.
Ah, and how old was he when that happened?
He was 40.
40. Was it from a sickness?
It was from the disease that they finally were able to diagnose while he was in prison. And it was a genetic disease that he had to have gotten from his birth mother.
Huh. That really, see, that leads back to that, that rule out phase. What was the DNA, the family? I mean, the genealogy is an important part of life. Wow, 40 years old. So the ailments very well could have played a key role in his psychology. Like it really could have been affecting him psychologically. So moving into let's talk. Go ahead. I'm sorry. No, that's me. I always do that. Go ahead. Finish what you're saying. We'll move to me.
Oh, I was just going to say the never ending conversation about nurture and nature, and there's really no absolute answer to that question. It's interesting to consider.
Indeed. So we're going to talk about the time when he kills his adopted father, and then he runs. So let's pick up from there. Where does he run to? What is his life looking like up until the point where he's detained?
Well, after he committed the murder, he loaded up his truck. He had a truck that he had use of. They said it was his truck, but it really was the parents' truck that he had the use of with certain expectations. But he loaded up all his music equipment, his clothes, threw it in the back of the truck. His dad had left on the kitchen counter his paycheck from the week, and Dwayne thought that would fuel his getaway and wrote Don's name on the back of the check and put it in his pocket. And he took off. And it's interesting because I had access to all of his statements, and it did vary depending on when he told his story, but generally it was about the same. Initially, he expressed that he wanted to go to Canada, that around Labor Day weekend, the family had taken a trip up to Vancouver because the World's Fair, there used to be a World's Fair, the World's Fair was up there. And they thought that with everything that was going on, a getaway with some family friends was just what the family needed to try to get away from everything that was going on. So they had gone up there, and during the time they were there, Dwayne at this time, of course, is 16. And he met a girl who was part of a family that they stayed with up there, and they kind of hit it off. So initially it appears that Dwayne intended to take that $2,000 check and use it to fund his trip up to Canada. But that's not what happened. He didn't play out that way. And it's hard to know because he never talked about then wanting to go to Canada. It's just he shot his dad. It was about 3 a.m, and he left the house with his belongings and went to a small convenience store that was maybe 8 miles away. The family knew the couple that owned the store, and Dwayne knew that the store would be open early. And his intention was to buy some cigarettes and to get some batteries. It's unknown what he wanted the batteries for, but it's suspected that maybe if he had to hide out somewhere. Anyway, he wanted batteries. So he went to the store. And while he was at the store, he had to wait around before the owner got there because it was still early in the morning, he met a woman who was walking down the street, a young woman in her early 30s, and they struck up a conversation. So that was interesting, that whole exchange that he had with this woman, and she was walking to her home. That's also interesting. I don't know how much detail you want me to go into the story, but they didn't know each other from before, and they were talking, and he was telling her about his music, and she said she had to walk to her house, which was about a half a mile away, and her feet were hurting, and so he offered to give her a ride, and she hesitant. She's thinking to herself in her statement later, I didn't know the guy, I didn't want to get in the truck with him. I mean, he was nice enough, but she was hesitant. Well, when the owner of the store showed up and recognized Dwayne, it made her let her guard down. So after he purchased his batteries, she let him take her to her house. And at which point she and her boyfriend invited Dwayne into the house, and they smoked marijuana and drank beer. And Dwayne proceeded to tell them that he'd shot and killed his father.
Whoa. Whoa.
Well, and what's the surprising thing about that, Adam, is they didn't think much of it. Maybe it was they were under the influence, so they thought, oh, well, whatever, man. I don't know. But their response was, oh, we just thought he was, kind of in just ranting aimlessly, and we didn't think much of it. I mean, and that seems rather odd. But eventually, he stayed with them. Then he told her that he was going to go see some friends of his, which actually he had stopped to see between the time he left the house and he went to the convenience store. But anyway, he told her where he was going and gave her his phone number. And then he left and he went to this other place. And it wasn't until later in the morning that this young woman and her boyfriend decided maybe they should call the sheriff's office and just tell them about having had this conversation with this strange guy. So in the long run, those conversations gave law enforcement the heads up that something had happened. But in the meantime, we're talking by now, it's around 9 o'clock in the morning. Dwayne's sister, who was born 5 years later, she was born in 75, and she had come home from a sleepover, and she was the one that found her dad shot and killed in bed, and she was 10 years old at the time. So it was a really traumatic event for all the members of that family. And then the daughter had to call her mother, who was out of town at the time at a high school reunion, and tell her, Mom, Dad's dead. I came home and he's dead. So it was very horrible.
I would have to say,
so it wasn't it. Go ahead.
Well, I mean, these people, the guy tells them, hey, I killed my dad. Me personally, oh, you killed your dad. What stops you from killing me? There's no way you're staying here. But yes, they did come to their senses and call law enforcement. This guy, Dwayne, could have very easily became a serial killer because he has all the hallmarks, right? He's going to drift. He's taking money. He manipulates. By explaining to them that he killed his father, makes me think he was trying to impose an alpha state. Like it's a creepy thing because I've read about a lot of serial killers, and he sounds like the early he has the early marks of one. So then it makes you wonder, as in his childhood, the disturbing behaviors his mother and father were seeing in him. I don't know if they ever caught him harming animals or anything like that. I'm sure if he was hiding it well. because he wouldn't even fess up to purchasing beer. He wouldn't fess up to having weed in the house. So it's very likely he was doing or having exempling other behaviors that they couldn't see. It's a creepy story. Like this, I think they might have prevented another serial killer. I mean, it very well might be, because think about this. He goes to prison or a juvenile detention center and attacks someone immediately with the intentions of not being amongst juveniles because they were beneath him. This is the mindset of a psychopathic alpha person, right? I got to tell you, Leslie, I've heard stories of some of these serial killers and the way they speak and think, and it borders intelligent with psychopathy. It's crazy, so.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And I don't know, you said you were listening to the audiobook, so maybe you were distracted with the portion in his upbringing. But when he was between 4 and 5, he tried to drown a litter of kittens.
Wow. See, I had to have missed that part, which makes me want to listen to it again.
Yeah.
So that's another hallmark. That's another hallmark. I'm glad I might have missed that part, because again, I was telling you in pre-podcast, I threw the earphones in, playing pool, practicing pool, and listening to the audiobook, and you're right, could have been distracted. That's a definite sign, right? He's harming animals. Just these people prevented a future serial killer. I mean, he might not have had a long career because he seemed a little more bold and like an example. Ted Bundy was 2 different people. That guy was 2 people. Mm-hmm. Like when you spoke to him publicly, he was a very charismatic. They say attractive, but in the eye of the beholder. But he was very charismatic and very well spoken. He well read. He was a college grad. He's going to be a lawyer. And the other part of him is like this vicious killer who killed a lot of women, a lot. And scary enough, the only way, and he broke out of jail twice. Mm-hmm. And he was going to defend himself in court. And the only reason they caught this guy was for a traffic infraction.
Yeah.
It's mind blowing.
Yeah.
And this Dwayne guy takes money, a truck, and it sounds like he's going to start drifting, and very well could have been a danger to a lot of people. A lot. Mm-hmm. That's creepy. So in you writing this, what are your feelings as you learn more about this? What did you grab from it?
Oh gosh. I guess there were a couple things. See, Cherie was my friend, right? So a lot of it for me when I read it or wrote it to have it be read by others, I just thought about how she was as a mom, how she was disappointed she couldn't have kids and how excited she was to have him. And then all the hopes and dreams that they had as a couple, and then losing the love of her life. And then what is she going to do? Because she loves her son, but she hates him, and she's afraid of him now. And in all of his behavior and all of the things that he did, she was never afraid of him. And she didn't think he was capable of what he did. And so it made her wonder, who is this person? So all that she had to endure, I think of it kind of from a mother's point of view. And I think the interesting part is also in looking back, you see red flags that as they have added up over the years become a big deal. But at the time you think, well, the kittens was kind of a serious thing, but, yeah. And he made all kinds of excuses. The kid's little, he said they wanted to swim, he said. And then he said, well, one of the cats scratched him, so he threw the cat in the creek. And it was just, they never got an answer out of him. And it was as things added up. But then you think about Cherie going to counselors and saying, these are the things I see, and nobody could help her. And then I remember her explaining to me when she sat in those hearings and she listened to the psych evals, and she's just feeling like, well, maybe somebody's going to help him now, and just that sense of, I tried to get help and I couldn't, and here we are, and how do I move forward from this, and living a life without her husband. So the emotion of it all affected me a lot.
Yeah, I
And
would
then
say.
I also think I wanted people to read this. I tried very hard not to editorialize in any way, and to just report the facts and have people sort of mill that around in their mind, and like you're doing, like we're doing now. And that's what I think makes the book different from other crime stories. Like I said earlier, it's not just the crime. It's, in fact, Dr. Sasser, a psychiatrist, I had him read the book and ask him to write a review. And he wrote a very interesting review. And he starts out saying, can a purely evil heart change? And can a broken heart forgive? And I thought that was really good. And then he talks about how it's a chronicle. The book is a chronicle about the sociopath, and can he be different? And the mother who's trying to learn whether or not she can forgive after dealing with the loss of her husband. So I just think it's a lot of mental, it's a heavy and really sad and tragic book.
It really is. I mean, if you think about it, what is empathy, right? Because we can't see it in an X-ray or a CT scan. As far as we know, it's not chemically induced. We just know it's part of the program of the brain, right? It's something that's like, it's hard to explain. It like if you have a daydream, right, or if you're fantasizing, you are constructing images and sounds in your mind, right? Even if you're recalling a memory, you're not getting an exact memory. It's your computer. Your brain is reconstructing to the best of its ability what it recalls. So you're not really seeing it truly. So it's hard to say, can you change an evil heart? Because until we discovered a mystery, because we know more about Mars than we do with the human brain, until you could figure out how to, I don't know, repair empathy. Can you do it? Is it possible? I think it has to be willing of the person to want to, but even then, if you had no empathy to begin with, it's really hard. I don't know. That's a great question. That's a great way to put it. I have no idea. I'm sure there's a lot of people that are in prisons and they're evaluating these psychopaths and serial killers and murderers. 9 out of 10 times, the people that murder in the heat of passion, they're the ones that feel guilty and they have remorse. But when you see these serial killers in their interviews, they don't care. In fact, I was talking about this yesterday with a homicide detective, Jason White. In a previous podcast, I had Cloyd Steiger on and his partner, and we were talking about one of the serial killers that they caught up in your region, your neck of the woods, in fact. And he's, regular guy saying, hey guys, how you doing? Give me some burgers. Or, they're just talking like normal people. And when they bring up the name of one of the victims that got away, his entire personality altered. He went from, hey guys, it's going, yeah, I know who that is. Like, that's a creepy idea. It's like something switched in his mind. The predator came out, right? The person's no longer available. So with Dwayne, all the factors in his childhood, the ailments, and you can't even chalk it up to just peer pressure and ailments, because we all went through it. And I went through it. I didn't kill anybody. You know what I mean? So now it makes me wonder about his father, his biological father. Did they ever do any research on who he was?
Well, the way I had information about his parents at all was because at one point while Dwayne was in prison, he told Cherie that he said he was doing a lot of self evaluation. And part of that was he wanted to understand more of who he was, not maybe how he thinks and maybe trying to figure all that out, but also wanting to know about his biological parents. And they were given very little information about the parents other than their ages and just a slight description of the father and mother. That was all they were given at the time. So Cherie, wanting to be supportive of Dwayne, hired a private investigator. And it was through the private investigator that the information that I have in the book, that's where that came from. And there's still not a lot more. There was contact information. I didn't pursue that because it really wasn't pertinent. I wasn't going to
Right.
go down that road. But so, yeah, that's very interesting to consider. And then if you look at, there's a fellow that wrote a book called Without Conscience. And he was one of the people that designed some of these tests that they give to inmates and other people to see if you're on the scale of if you are a sociopath or not. And he has a part in his book that talks about children. If we were able to diagnose, if Dwayne had been diagnosed when she first took him, let's say it was fifth grade, and it was someone that was trained enough that they could identify that he was a sociopath at that age, would that have mattered? And all they could say was, at least in this part of the book that I read, was that it would equip the parents to know that that's what the child was, and maybe equip them to be able to handle circumstances with that knowledge. You know, if finding that out also equipped them to, okay, in these situations, this is how better to handle it than if your kid is a normal, mentally healthy person. You don't have to do these things. Now, whether that will change the ultimate outcome, they were saying it's hard to say. They kind of were indicating what you said, that some things can't be changed.
Right.
So even if you know that, yeah.
Because what do? Do you go to a doctor, get an empathy and a remorse injection? No, you can't do it.
Yeah.
It reminds me of the show Dexter. You ever seen that show?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Where the father's like, look, this is what you are, but how do we mold it so this way you're not harming innocent people, right? Because in a society, if like for me, and I'm going to be honest when I say this, and people, when they hear me say it's like, oh, what's wrong with you? If you hear murderers are being murdered, do you care? There's a fine line. It is human life. But now there's these people who are victimizing, they're predators amongst other humans, and they're just mysteriously disappearing. I don't know how concerned I'd be. So it's and that even being said by me examples a little bit of lack of remorse, because it's still a human life. But you're weighing the greater good, I imagine. And so for this kid, if they did see these hallmarks, and how do you address that? I don't know that you could change it. It's outside of what do? You lock them up forever in a peaceful, padded area? I don't know. That's a great question. And I'm going to have to dive into that now.
I don't know, but I remember years ago I took a corrections class, and I remember them saying that there are 3 reasons that people are incarcerated. And the first and the primary reason is to protect society. And the secondary reason was its punishment. And the third one was rehabilitation. And it seems to me when we hear so much about repeat offenders that are out and then reoffending in a major way, it's hard to drum up a lot of sympathy for the offender when you see what's happening to innocent people.
Right. Yeah,
So I don't know. Yeah.
it's tough.
Yeah.
And I have people all the time. I have a lot of relatives and friends that are very, very religious. I'm not. I'm not for any other reason than I can't subscribe to literature that I feel like was, sort of manipulated for the idea of control and keeping society ordered. But if I said this to a few people, if you have to read literature to not kill people, you should be checked out. If your only motivation not to kill people or harm people is you don't want to go to prison, you should probably go see a doctor, right? Because that's a sign, Everyone gets this thing where like, oh, the neighbor pissed me off, I should kill him, but they don't really mean it. They're going to go have lunch and forget about it. There's other people who plot their demise and see it through, so it's a fine line. So for you, before we close out, what other cases have you, historically speaking, that caught your interest as far as true crime?
Oh, well, since you asked that question, I'll tell you what I'm mulling over in my mind, actually.
Excellent.
And that is, I'm mulling over doing a second book, and it would be about Edmund Kemper. You're familiar with him, aren't you?
Yeah.
Okay. And the reason there's been lots of books about him, but I was stalked by him.
What?
And his mother, he for a short time, but lived across the street from me when I was a teenager, an older teenager, and I was stalked by him. So there's a story that's never been told about a portion of his life. He murdered his grandparents when he was 15. You knew that, right?
Yeah, I've saw some documentaries, and he's featured in a show, and they've kind of went over that, not in great detail, but they've kind of gone over that.
Well, basically, he had a very abusive, weird childhood, and his mother couldn't take care of him anymore. She couldn't manage him anymore. Sent him to live with his paternal parents. And at 15, he shot and killed the grandparents. And he was then taken to, he was housed in Atascadero. That's in California. It's at that time was some sort of a mental correctional facility. And then at 21, they decided he was cured and they let him out.
What?
Yeah. And so then he led somewhat of a life for a while. In fact, he was released to his mother, I believe, which was not a healthy situation. So he went through this period of time where not a whole lot went on, but I happened in his life during that time. And he was ramping up because, see, this happened in Santa Cruz, and that's where he ended up getting called the co-ed killer. But there's a story in there that I know would be a bookseller, but it's also kind of a mentally charged topic for me.
Yeah,
because it's everything.
Yeah, you have a direct impact from that. I encourage you to write that book. I would read it. And I would promote it heavily. Keep in mind, that guy's almost 7 feet tall. He is a big dude. He is menacing. And then top it off, because my first introduction to him, I started watching the show called Mindhunter. And
yes.
I was intrigued. I was like, this can't be a real guy, is it? And I looked him up and I saw him, and he's a giant. He's an absolute giant. And top it off, his demeanor in the interviews, the real interviews, when you watch the real interviews, he's talking about these murders as if he's just, you and I are sitting down talking about the ball game, right?
Yeah.
Zero remorse. And no way, you see in his face, he doesn't even change emotion. He speaks about it as if he's lecturing on a topic he's interested in. And that bothered me to my core. That bothered me. I've seen interviews with people who've murdered people and gangsters who were they're reformed, and you could see remorse on them. You could see it's the guilt on their face. This guy, I don't know, man. If I'm you and that guy was around you and I would freak out. He is menacing to look at.
Well, what's interesting about that is I never saw him. But he called me on the phone.
Every hair on my body just stood up.
And I'll tell you, when he called me that first time, I knew it was an obscene phone call. Let me just say that. And I just knew that it was very matter of fact. It was like like a crank phone call, but
Right.
not like that, because he was just like you said, he was very matter of fact. He just said what he had to say, called me by name.
Jeez.
And then subsequently a lot more phone calls, stuff was going on. And we had a deputy come out and take a report, and he's kind of blowing it off. Oh, we get these kind of calls all the time. I'm like, not this one. It wasn't like this one.
Yeah,
I can just tell you.
That just when you told me
But
that.
of course, they get those reports. But anyway, yeah, it kind of is what he was doing in the meantime. He was ramping up.
I'm in the process of reaching out to the Scott Peterson family and the private investigator that worked that case, because there's, even before this, like I recall when the Scott Peterson thing, when it happened, I'm going to be honest, I dismissed it. I was a kid, I was shooting pool, like, yeah, this guy did it, man. And then you later on hear some of the discrepancies, and now Hulu puts this docuseries out. And then when you do the research into that, something doesn't smell right there at all. And so I'm diving into that one. So this book that you're talking about writing, I really think you should do it. I really do. If nothing more, you could probably dive into more detail about the Kemper and then introduce your part of it, because there's not a lot of literature out there that speaks the way you do, the way you have a book. You really kind of dive in from the beginning to the end, where people, they just want the meat. Just give me the meat. I want to hear the gruesome part. You go a different direction. I like that. And that's the way it should be, because you should kind of, it's the same way like when you watch The Godfather and you see Michael Corleone in the beginning, he's hell-bent, I'm never going to be part of my father. And you watch him in the course of 2 hours transform. And by the end of the movie, it's not that he's this villain. You're kind of still cheering for him, but you recognize that he's came to the spot. You've seen the transition, and that's what you did in your book. You show the transition, because most people, when they hear about true crime, give me the meat. Tell me what this guy did, and tell me what the outcome is. It's not good enough. You need to do what you do and really lay out this person's family, and then especially when you're talking about the mother and she has to give him up for adoption and the emotional circumstances that come with that. I think you did great on that. I applaud it.
Oh, thank you.
So before we close out, go ahead and name your book and any other sites you want. I'll put it in description so people could find it.
Okay, it's The Decision to Kill. I think if you even just Google that, it will come up without the subtitle. It can be found on Amazon. I have a website, and it's just Decision to Kill, and then it pulls up everything. It has reviews, it has pictures of the property, pictures of the people, some pictures of Dwayne when he was younger, the family together. I had total access to family albums, and I think it makes the story even more interesting when you can see where something actually happened. So there's pictures of the house. So I would encourage anybody to go to the website. And also I have a Facebook page. You'll have my name written down there because people won't be able to spell it. But yeah, I have an author Facebook page with my name. You're welcome to look at that. There's some videos there. There's pictures, more pictures. Message me. I always like to hear what people have to say and their thoughts about the book. And I just want to say how much I appreciate you recognizing the difference in this book. I know for some true crime people, they might have been, or there were some that indicated in their reviews they were disappointed. I don't know. They felt like there was too much background, but that's the way I wanted it written. And that's what Cherie wanted. She wanted people to know the story and know, actually, besides the tragedy of it, to be encouraged by it, by what she went through, and that she stayed true to her feelings of love for her son, despite all the things that she went through, not giving in to his pleas, but being there for him as his mother. And so I appreciate that was a interesting way to tell the story for you.
I'll tell you why. And for people that have these kind of negative reviews, if you want to be a sleuth or a detective and you want to, learn for the future cases, or even have some kind of insight, you have to hear all parts. You can't hear the part you want. There's some allure to it. It's sexy. I get it. But it's not a clean way of looking at it. You need what Leslie does. You need to see every part moving forward. Because for me, if I could dig further, I would look into this guy's full genealogy, right down to the great-great-grandparents. Because it lets you know, it lets you see the transfer, how the transversion comes, how it comes to be. How did this individual become a sociopath, a psychopath? What led him on that path? And the only way to do that is if you do your due diligence. You can't just take the meaty part that you like, that's appealing. Because then you're not, as a sleuth, when you see future cases, or if there's a case that's active and you're forming opinions, you're not forming them clean. You don't have the proper education. You didn't learn the right way. You got to look at it from every perspective. So for those of you listening, I'm going to say good day, good evening, good night, whatever is for you. And I'm going to talk to Leslie in post.
Oh, can I add one quick thing?
Sure. No, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I just want to say that we are contributing a portion of every book sale to the Rock Recovery Center. It's an addiction program that helps both addicted people that want to deal with that, and the families of people that have addicted family members, to give them support. So it was some help that Cherie looked for and couldn't find, and we're wanting to help support that. Just wanted to let everyone know.
Indeed. I'll put that in the description as well. So everyone else, again, night, I'm going to talk to Leslie in post.